To all the watchers out there, thanks for tuning in. I'm Yvan from UbiOps, and if you're joining us live today, welcome to this live edition of our series of interviews with MLOps thought leaders. Today's session, we're going to take on more of a fireside chat format, during which today's guest and I will start out talking through a few core questions regarding the background, trends, challenges, and how to solve them, followed by which we're going to open the floor for an audience Q&A. If you think of a question during the first portion of the session, don't hesitate to send it in via the chat, and we'll address it during the Q&A. So let's get into it. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Onno de Koster. Onno is a colleague of mine here at UbiOps and works in business development with a focus on the financial services industry, or FSI. Onno not only has a wealth of experience in the field, but also has precise knowledge of the coveted AI and machine learning operations, or MLOps, that niche that so many FSI businesses try to keep locked up. So, Onno, it's really great to have you here. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Yvan. Thank you for the introduction. So a bit about myself. I joined UbiOps a couple of months ago. I left the previous firm earlier this year. It was a multi-strategy, multi-manager hedge fund. I was their CRO, and I was there 10 years. And before that, I worked at what we call an FSI on the sell side, so at various banks in roles as a quant structurer, trader, etc.
Right. So were you more involved in the sort of practical side of the AI and the ML, or in the kind of operations behind the scene?
Certainly more the practical side. So the applications I mostly dealt with were kind of traditional ML, as you call them these days. So regression models to do factor modeling on portfolios. But I also looked, as I was a co-founder in another business, also at other applications in AI, such as deep learning and other sort of forecasting models for time series.
Those are kind of pretty standard applications that people use, right, in the financial services?
When you say financial services, that's actually a very wide definition. Now, financial services include banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, asset managers, but also a whole raft of organizations, all under the name of fintech. And then within fintech, you also have got insurtech, etc., etc. And those are sort of, I would say, AI-centered, mostly AI-centered scale-ups of startups with a specific AI-driven product, which can be implemented to larger companies within the financial services. And by larger companies, typically meaning the banks and the insurers.
Could you give some examples of AI or ML use cases, or maybe even certain models that a particular business type would be interested in?
Most models I see being implemented are still the traditional machine learning models. And say most of them, especially in banks and customer-facing financial institutions, are to do with fraud detection, anti-money laundering, stuff like that. But also things like credit risk prediction or prediction of churn, of whether a customer of an organization is going to leave the organization, and with what probability. And the models in there used are still sort of more the traditional machine learning models. And by traditional, I mean everything which is not Gen AI, because Gen AI nowadays is a very popular term. Now, Gen AI, there's a lot of talk about, and actually there's a lot of experimentation nowadays within banks and insurance companies to see what use cases they can use this for, because potentially they're very strong models. Nowadays, still the application focuses more on customer-facing chatbots, or chatbots for internal use. By internal use, I mean where customer-facing personnel when they need to answer a question of a client of theirs, quite often they need to go through a lot of text, a lot of information within the organization to able to produce a sensible and a good answer. And chatbots, internal chatbots, can really help there. So I've actually seen in a recent conference a demo of that, of an internal chatbot by a Scandinavian bank. We have been using this chatbot already for a few years, but it was very impressive. And the results of that in terms of customer satisfaction, as well as satisfaction by staff, has been immense. A staff member does have to go through rafts and rafts of documents, which is tedious. You just ask that specific question to the chatbot, get some answers back, then gives its own interpretation on these answers, also really checking whether it makes sense, because obviously still with LLM results, you still want to make sure that what comes out is sensible. And then give that information back to the customer in their own way of phrasing it to their customer. I think that's a very good use case for Gen AI in financial services and in other industries, in fact.
I think that's a great example to give, the example of chatbots. Indeed, because I think a lot of people think about, when they think of generative AI and they think of chatbots, it's like, oh, it's just simplifying the work of the business and allowing them to save money. When in fact, it's also about the customer satisfaction side of it, about being able to give actually a really good answer to someone's question without having to have a specific knowledge holder there on the chat with them at that time. So multiple different kind of businesses actually falling into that umbrella of financial services, each with actually quite a broad selection of goals and interests, really, and target consumers. How is this going to affect a company's MLOps requirements?
The actual application, be it random forest or be it an LLM, for example, doesn't really have doesn't make much difference in terms of the MLOps aspect. So the common aspects to be able to put ML in production are applicable for both. So one is, well, first of all, you really need to make sure that you've got the relevant data, the clean data, and access to the data to even start applying AI or ML, because that's what you need for running those models. And because these models are becoming more and more complex, and more data is being used to train those, you need more and more compute. And certainly, if you use a lot of machine learning models, the cost of that can be very quickly very high. And that is not only for large corporates, but also for startups. Certainly, AI-centered startups, where AI is all they use. For them, it's extremely important to really make use of very cost-efficient infrastructure. So we're talking about cost, but we're also talking about access to the computing resources, so the relevant GPUs, etc. And nowadays, we often experience that there's actually bottlenecks in access to these GPUs. So you want to use a provider like UbiOps, but there may be other providers who can guarantee you, or at least can sort of give you a high probability of access to those GPUs on demand. Now, monitoring is also extremely important. And then we're talking about more of the life cycle of machine learning applications, because once it's into production, you need to make sure that it's robustly used, that it can handle bursts in activity, a request for inferencing, that you also need to make sure that you know when to retrain those models. So are you going to monitor that via some kind of application to test the ongoing performance of your machine learning performance against some benchmark cases? Or are you going to just reschedule, I schedule retraining at specific times, say weekly or daily or monthly, All of that obviously needs to be set up properly in a system to do that robustly and securely. So these are typically the commonalities of putting machine learning into production.
Before we carry on, I just want to give a little bit of a definition of MLOps, machine learning operations, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, because it can encompass multiple different things. And so just want to make sure that everyone knows what we're talking about. So indeed, machine learning operations, MLOps, it's a big part of what we do at UbiOps, and it's basically all the processes required to successfully take an AI or machine learning model to market. So everything from tooling that's going to ensure availability, reliability, security of your models, to orchestration, managing the computing resources, data pipelines, etc. All these things that are going on behind the scenes. And oftentimes teams are going to be patching together these functionalities with multiple different tools. They're going to source their processing from multiple services. But just going to add in a little quick product placement here. At UbiOps, we actually streamline that entire MLOps and AI infrastructure experience to go through one single control plane that's compatible with cloud setups, in-house setups, multi-cloud, hybrid, you name it. We can get that working for you all in one place. So MLOps, financial services, that's kind of the area that we want to be talking about. So Onno, what have you found to be the most prominent AI or machine learning trends in the financial services industry in recent years? And feel free to focus on a particular type of business if that's your area of expertise.
So I'd say the main trends I've seen so far, over the last few years, are deep learning for predictions. So, for example, for prediction, churn prediction, but also within the asset management industry, the use of alternative data sets and more of data. And by alternative data, meaning essentially all data which is not traditional. Traditional data within the financial markets are time series of stock prices, index prices, and so on, and also volumes of trades and so on. Whereas alternative data can be anything else: satellite data, consumer data, footfall in supermarkets, what have you. And deep learning is more and more used to use more and more diverse data sets, as well as deep learning has got much more better performance than more smaller models. Another main trend is Gen AI, as I mentioned before. A lot of talk about that. Clearly, obviously, since ChatGPT was introduced last year, everybody seems to talk about generative AI. It obviously has been spoken about for many years before. And I think that's also a trend I see a lot in financial services, at least being experimented with it. Frankly, the putting of Gen AI, and I mean by Gen AI basically LLMs, putting those in production is still not done widely in many firms. But I see I see more and more players actually trying to do so, and clearly the startups in the fintech scene, quite a few are actually LLM driven startups.
What kind of data infrastructure or organizational structure changes do these kinds of technologies require?
A very good question. I think AI in general, as in compared to more traditional software development, is requires a different culture almost in an organization, and a very especially in terms of collaboration between various areas which may within large organizations been traditionally siloed before. And I'm talking here about the business side of a bank or insurance company, the IT department, and then say the data scientists. To really make good use of AI and successfully implement it, you really need good collaboration between those three areas. and also the use case and the business case for actually starting an AI journey really needs to be properly assessed. I can't just think that, oh, we sprinkle a bit of AI magical dust over here, and all of a sudden we have fantastic results and making loads of money. That's not how it works.
So right now, obviously, Gen AI and foundation models, LLMs, taking the industry by storm. What do you see coming as the next big AI trend, particularly in FSI?
Regulation and consolidation. Regulation meaning obviously regulation stipulated by regulators and central banks and so on. Consolidation in terms of organizations who are able to adapt AI successfully in organizations will have the right to be relevant. Others will become irrelevant. And consolidation will take some time. We're not talking months, we're talking probably years here. The regulation is certainly on a shorter time frame.
So now that we have sort of an overview of the AI and financial services landscape, I'd like to talk about the MLOps challenges specifically that apply to FSI businesses deploying AI. So let's start with a sort of a scenario. Let's say we're a portfolio manager and we want to deploy an LLM model, for example. Let's say we're doing sentiment analysis on a particular company, publicly listed. What's going to make this difficult for us?
Essentially, as you mentioned, LLMs, there's a plethora of LLMs out there, and you will need to find the models which will work for you in production for this particular task. So you will need to choose the models out of that whole universe of models, then find the data sets which you as organization want to use to fine tune your model on. Because clearly you can get those models pre-trained, but you need to fine tune them for the particular task you want to employ them to. And it comes with data requirements for that as well. Now, you can get probably away with running this maybe in a notebook when your organization is a few staff. And assuming you still have the relevant GPUs to fine tune and run the compute when it comes to inferencing. However, in a larger organization, you will have definitely need to version control your model, version control the data, as in you want to know what data you used when you trained or fine-tuned your model. You need obviously proper access control to those models and to the data used for the fine-tuning. And you will need a proper CI/CD framework. You want to update your model, you want to replace models. So how do you actually change your models whilst you have a current model in production? So that's all of that sort of CI/CD framework, which is a term of software technology, requires a significant infrastructure for running those, and that's all MLOps basically.
So from an MLOps perspective, which of those parts is going to occupy the most resources? Is it infrastructure, hiring, tooling? Is it maintaining your CI/CD framework? Is it the fine tuning part? What do you see there?
I'd say the infrastructure, meaning also including the access to the GPUs, IPUs to run the relevant compute, both for training as well as inference. And close to that, also the hiring. Now we at UbiOps obviously make it very easy for data scientists to be able to operationalize their AI ML workflows into production, so they can actually stay focused on producing relevant models for their businesses and not having to deal with the tooling, etc. But still, I think those organizations will have to have the data scientists in the first place to be able to put AI and ML in production. And as I said before, only those organizations will really embrace AI ML, and they'll are the ones who are going to survive.
How long does it typically take a team to get their models up and running?
When we actually talk to customers or potential customers, when we actually already talk to data scientists who have something in the notebooks, they now are ready to take the step to put in production. That step with UbiOps takes essentially a few days, if not less. Basically uploading the code, we can then do the containerization, make it into microservices, etc., etc. That, because of the way we designed our platform, takes a few days less or less. Question, of course, is if you don't use UbiOps and you now sit at a stage of proof of concept to put it into production, then still you're talking at least a few months, if not, hiring the staff, getting the staff to understand what you actually want to do. Then the staff you hire, MLOps engineers, DevOps engineers, to put it all together, relevant tools, relevant infrastructure, etc., etc. That's still another few months compared to need the few days if you were to just use UbiOps.
So what is sort of the main MLOps challenge that you see FSI businesses facing today?
It depends if I talk to fintech, a startup fintech, or a large bank. The main challenge with fintech is truly the resources necessary to put their AI products, because I'm talking about fintechs with an AI-driven product. The challenge is for them the hiring and the putting into altogether into infrastructure. Nextly, that's also for me an easy discussion to have, because one, they are typically very knowledgeable about machine learning and what it takes to put in production, and they see immediately the need for a platform like ours and the features it brings them. Whereas a discussion with a large corporation, typically the large banks, the challenge really is whether it's a joint up structure, organizational structure, and culture within the bank to really have a sort of a holistic view within an organization as to how we can or how they can put machine learning into a proper and robust framework, rather than disjointed businesses. Quite often you see that they do a lot of POCs, but the percentage of POCs, and I'm talking about POCs of AI machine learning, a small fraction still is being put in production, certainly in the large banks where there's not a consolidated effort between the various departments I just mentioned.
So in the context of these challenges, what is the biggest mistake that financial services industry businesses are making in regards to deploying their AI?
I'd say there are probably two. One is not having realized or not have a good enough realization that you really need good data, but also access to that data, and timely access to the data, for the data to be at sufficient quality and at sufficient quantity as well for machine learning to be useful on that. So that's on the data management side of things. Secondly, the biggest mistake is not having thought through about what it actually costs to put it into production from an infrastructure point of view, but also from a resources point of view in terms of staff and the ongoing requirement of resources to keep it live into production.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the common thread there is kind of a lack of a strategizing step before getting started.
Yes.
Not thinking about, all right, what kind of structural changes do we need to make? What kind of data organization changes do we need to make before we dive into this? I think it's about time we open the floor for questions. What do you think, Onno?
Great idea. Thanks, Yvan.
Great. Before we move on, I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining me, Onno. I think we all learned a lot about AI in the financial services industry and the MLOps challenges involved, the current trends that are going on. If you haven't already, feel free to write down your questions in the chat, and we'll pick them up, and Onno and I can answer them. Thank you very much again, Onno.
Thanks. It was a pleasure. Thank you.